Let's look at a little more detail at the first objection. So on page 281, Scarry claims or tells the reader that with the same acute aversion, well, not a perceived torture, rather, with the same acute aversion which one's own legal culpability and one's own death are perceived, while a jury might exonerate someone in a ticking bomb case, it does not follow that society ought to guarantee exoneration before the fact, nor should someone enter into the act expecting exoneration. That one might have to do something someday that is wrong does not mean that the act has ceased to be wrong and punishable. Any savior of the city would actually be unlikely to be inhibited by the lack of pre-existing moral and legal assurances of immunity. So the idea behind this objection seems to be that Dershowitz is proposing this warrant process for torture because without this guarantee of immunity in these cases, people aren't going to have the personal courage to engage in torture in order to save these people. And she thinks that that's just inaccurate of the sort of emotional courage that would be demonstrated by people in those circumstances. Now, I find this objection kind of troubling in two ways. First, it seems to suppose that Dershowitz is proposing the warrant system as a means of making sure that the right outcome is achieved in these ticking bomb cases. And that's not the relationship I see between the ticking bomb scenario and the warrant proposal. I see them as related in a quite different way. The warrant proposal isn't supposed to bring about the right outcome in the ticking bomb case. It's supposed to temper our natural inclination towards practicing torture under certain circumstances by judicial review, visibility, and in so doing, minimize the number of cases where torture actually occurs and hopefully make them more or less just the set where it's actually effective or necessary. And that isn't the relationship that Scarry seems to suppose here. So I find that her supposition about why Dershowitz is proposing warrants in this objection to be troubling. It also sort of buys into the basic logic of the ticking bomb scenario. She seems to suggest that in a ticking bomb scenario, that the right thing to do is the quote unquote wrong thing to do. That people should, in fact, torture in those ticking bomb scenarios and save those people's lives. Now, you may have that intuition. That may be what you think ought to be done in those cases. But it's not actually consistent with her overall position that torture should be exceptionlessly prohibited, that no one should ever torture for any reason. And I guess the supposition here is that the right thing to do in these ticking bomb cases is the quote unquote wrong thing to do. And that just seems oxymoronic, self contradictory. All right? That the appropriate stance towards torture is always that it never should be done, but in these cases it should be done, but even then it shouldn't be done. So I find this troubling. And the next objection I think is equally bothersome. So I look at the third objection that she offers second because it's also about emotional reactions and the warrant process. So in this third of her criticisms, the next one I'm looking at, you could call it a sort of absence of clear standards of evidence criticism. And what she argues is that it's necessary to have fear of punishment and abhorrence of violence and pain, because having to overcome that is a powerful test of your confidence in the applicability of the ticking bomb scenario. That is, you have to really have a strong conviction that the ticking bomb scenario is what you're in, that it really is going to be necessary to torture someone because it's the only way to save these people. really have to have an overwhelmingly strong, reliable, trustworthy belief in that in order to do it acting on your own conviction. She thinks judicial review, where prosecutor or agent would gather the evidence together, try to present a coherent, structured argument for why torture is the appropriate response in this circumstance, submit it to a judge. The judge reviews it in accordance with past precedents and current regulations and makes a decision as to whether or not this looks like a ticking bomb case. Now, her claim, I think, is something that I don't share her intuition about, that people's sort of emotional gut judgments about these things are going to turn out to be better, more reliable judgments than judgments that are based on evidence, regulation, and precedent made by a disinterested third party. Now, I'm not at all convinced of that, but that's the argument. The argument is that the best way for someone to decide if they're in a ticking bomb scenario, for it to be determined whether or not terrorists should be tortured, is for people to rely on their own convictions under fear of punishment and adversity to inflicting the pain associated with the activities, as opposed to evidence-based contemplation by people who don't have anything at stake in the situation. So I'm not convinced that that's a reasonable case. But again, it seems to offer up a connection between the ticking bomb case and the warrant proposal that I don't think is in Dershowitz's mind. Dershowitz, I don't think, is proposing that in order to get the right judgments in the ticking bomb case, what we really need to do is have this warrant proposal. His reasons for the warrant proposal have to do with whether or not they are going to result in at least a more orderly kind of decision process for torture that promotes the democratic values of visibility and accountability, and that minimizes the number of actual torture cases and hopefully limits them to the cases where it is necessary to do it, if there are such cases. And this seems not to suppose that's what it is. It seems to suppose that warrants somehow are a means of facilitating getting the right outcome in these cases. And again, it seems to buy into the idea that in these cases, one really should be tortured, even though she seems to also say, and you should never do it. Now, there are other problems that we might worry about with this second case, but let's take a look at this third case before we do. So, in the third case, third criticism, she notes that it's really implausible to suppose that we're going to really be in a position to know that this terrorist knows the details that's going to foil this plot, and that we're going to be able to get that information out of them in an appropriate time so that we can act on it, foil the plot. That's a lot to know. And so on page 284, she notes that despite our overwhelming miscalculation, mismeasurement, and inability to solve mysteries both before and after they happen, or to put it in the fairest light, despite the excruciating difficulty of ever being right, we are asked to entertain the possibility of lifting the unconditional prohibition against torture, and to do so by imagining that one of us will recognize the ticking bomb accomplice the moment we see him. Further, the ticking bomb case assumes that we will be successful in our torture. So the idea here is that it seems to require some sort of superhuman ability to know what's at stake in the case, know what the outcome of particular courses of action are going to be, and so it therefore doesn't strike her as being a particularly likely scenario.